to this joint press conference on this day, the International Human Rights Day. The theme for this year is Our Rights, Our Future, Right Now. As stated by the United Nations Secretary General, this year's UN Human Rights campaign focuses on how human rights are a pathway to solutions, as they play a critical role as a preventive, protective, and transformative force for good, particularly in times of crisis. Unfortunately for us in Nigeria, it has been a most troubling time for the observance of human rights by state institutions. In particular, the Nigerian police, the primary law enforcement agency for internal security, remains and continues to operate like a criminal force, despite years of substantial investments and reform efforts. Of course, other agencies like the State Security Service, which likes to style itself DSS, and the EFCC, have also been on the prowl, abusing and misusing their law enforcement powers, flagrantly violating human rights. The police, which ought to protect, enforce, and operate in accordance with the law, instead routinely break the law in the most egregious and reckless manner. The Nigerian police's needless violent approach to carrying out arrest of citizens, particularly over civil wrongs, blatantly violate the Police Act 2020. The police's willingness to easily offer themselves as tools of oppression and repression, of dissent and freedom of expression, and for settling scores is most disgraceful and subversive of the due process and undermine the rule of law on which democracy thrives. The trending case of Dele Farotimi is not isolated. Across the country and on almost daily basis, this has been the pattern. Recently, prior to the case of Dele Farotimi, police operatives traveled from Imo State all the way to Abuja and violently and illegally seized one Dr. Nkwa, a former commissioner in Imo State under the government of Hope Uzodimma. They malhandled him and took him to Owerri, where he is currently languishing in police detention. His offense is criticizing the government and calling for transparency and accountability in governance. Similarly, an Owerri-based radio broadcaster, Nonso, popularly known as Nonso, was before Nkwa, for the second time, also seized by the Imo State Police Command at the behest of Governor Uzodimma. He has also remained in pre-trial custody at the Owerri Correctional Center following his similar abduction-style arrest for his critical stance on the performance and governance style of the governor of Imo State. These predatory and irresponsible policing tactics not only violate the due process and human rights of the victims, but also further deepen the negative public perception and destroy the legitimacy of the Nigerian police. Something urgently needs to give to address persistent police violence in Nigeria after NSAS in October 2020. On this occasion of the Human Rights Day 2014, RULAAC calls on the Inspector General of Police to order an end to the unprofessional, irresponsible, and abusive approaches of the police and to order the immediate release of Dele Farotimi from illegal detention in the Ekiti Correctional Center and Dr. Nkwa and Nonso in Imo State, as well as others suffering similar oppression and persecution on account of their exercising their democratic rights to freedom of expression. This press conference is necessitated by the urgent need to respond to egregious developments with regards to police conduct and practices and impunity for abuses and corruption. There is the urgent need for efforts to enhance police governance and deepen understanding of the Police Act 2020 and regulations across Nigeria to address critical gaps in the understanding and application of the Police Act and accompanying regulation within the Nigerian Police Force. The principles of the Police Act 2020 should not only be understood by both police and individuals, but should also be integrated into daily policing practices, thereby promoting a culture of lawfulness and respect for human rights within the Nigerian police. Now, let me take you to history. Far back in 2006, the Network on Police Reform in Nigeria, with support from some development partners, conducted extensive research on police abuses throughout Nigeria. I was part of that research. That effort sought to shine a light on the pervasive issues of police violence, torture, abuse, and extrajudicial killings by the police, with a view to breaking the cycle of silence and impunity. The objective of the research were as follows. One, to ground law enforcement policy and police reform in the realities faced by the Nigerian populace. Two, to document the patterns and prevalence of police abuse of human rights. Three, to inform the design of policy responses to public safety and security needs. Four, to build an informed constituency for effective and accountable policing. And five, to enable victims of police abuse to seek redress through internal and external oversight mechanisms. Independent field monitors were deployed across 14 states across over 9 months, using a representative sample across Nigeria's 6 geopolitical zones. Findings indicated that the actions and operations of the Nigerian police often contradict Nigerian laws and increasingly endanger the very lives they are meant to protect. Specifically, the key findings of that research were that the Nigerian police force increasingly operates as a criminal entity, serving political and financial interests rather than the public. Two, police officers often act with impunity, emboldened by a complete lack of accountability. Three, police are instruments of political repression used by influential individuals to settle scores and harass perceived adversaries. That human rights violations are systematically ignored or poorly investigated, with accountability measures rarely enacted. The research culminated in the publication of a book called Criminal Force: Torture, Abuse, and Extrajudicial Killing by I'm sure some of you would have seen that report. And that report called for urgent measures from various stakeholders, including the president, federal and state governments, the Police Service Commission, and Nigeria's international partners. Today, 18 years later, there appears to be no major shift from the situation and findings from that research, the result of 18 years ago. There appears to be no shift. From the NSAS protests to the allegations of organ harvesting by some operatives in Anambra State, for which the Inspector General of Police, in response to public outrage, set up an investigation which remains inconclusive till today, to the case of a senior officer who was indicted in the United States for fraud, and which led the United States to request for his extradition to answer to charges, to the recent cases that we have been witnessing, as outlined above. Police dabbling into civil disputes in contravention of the Police Act and offering themselves as tools for repression of expression, freedom of expression, and political dissent, and for settling scores, among other predatory and discreditable behavior. It is not in doubt that human rights is in retreat in Nigeria, despite our claims to being a democracy. The Nigerian Police Act, signed into law in September 2020, aimed to transition the police from a colonial and oppressive force to a democratic, community-centered entity. However, the recent NSAS protests illustrated the public's frustration with persistent police violence and impunity. Despite the enactment of the Police Act, the subsidiary police regulations remain outdated and contradictory, stalling meaningful reform. Stakeholders have put forth efforts to revise the police regulation, yet they are awaiting gazetting by the Federal Ministry of Justice, further obstructing progress. It is imperative for the Ministry of Justice to prioritize the gazetting of the renewed police regulation. This action is crucial for establishing a new legal framework that facilitates substantial police reform, promotes accountability, and enhances public trust in law enforcement. It is time for the government to commit to real change and address the systemic issues within the Nigerian police.